Well, for our final rights group, this is the second wave feminist movement. It's a long history. I mean, go back to Seneca Falls, you look at the forming of NASA, the National Women's Party, the gaining of the right to vote, flappers in the 20s. All of that is precursor to what happens in the 60s for women. A lot of the 60s fight for women is challenging gender norms. The assumption that women can only be viewed as mothers, as wives, they can only have certain jobs, they can be nurses, but never doctors. They can be teachers, but never principals. And so a lot of the 60s fight for women was both legal and social. A lot of these women had memories of World War II when they got out as Rosie the Riveter and they worked. But then that was crushed in the 50s with all those gender norms of Cold War cookie culture society. And they experienced a deep level of frustration in their lives that, they made cookies and they went to PTA and they gardened and they took care of their kids, but they didn't really have an identity of their own. Many of those stories were collected by Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique, which came out in 1963. She documented women's sense of dissatisfaction. That same year, women formed the National Organization for Women, which called for federal laws to protect women's equality, to challenge gender stereotypes. Big year, because that's the same year the Equal Pay Act, which addressed equal pay for equal work. So we know there are reasons why women don't get equal pay. It has to do with a lot of other things other than just working the same job as a guy. In 1972, there's the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have made men and women equal under the law. That, of course, gets through Congress, has to go to the states, and so it's a long fight for the states to approve it. In 73 is the pivotal case of Roe v. Wade, which protected a woman's right to choose whether or not to carry out a pregnancy within certain limits under the law. So you've got a whole bunch of activity that's happening in the 60s and 70s as women are challenging these norms of beauty, that they're supposed to look a certain way, that they can only be wives, they can only be mothers. But there's a backlash coming as well. Conservative women by the late 60s, early 70s are challenging the feminists to say that as a woman, if you wanted to be a wife and a mother, you should be able to choose that. And a lot of these conservative women did engage in some deceit and duplicity in the things they said about feminists. So there was a lot of misunderstandings there. Many of the conservative women followed the lead of Phyllis Schlafly, who was actually a lawyer, a mother, and had children, but she went on campaigns across the United States, didn't stay in her kitchen, and those campaigns were to encourage women to return to their God-given duties as wives and mothers. Her organization, Stop ERA, actually was successful in blocking the Equal Rights Amendment at the state level. For example, Stop ERA women in Georgia baked cakes and took it to the Georgia legislature and said, these cakes, you're not going to get them if you vote for ERA because women aren't going to be baking anymore. Or actually, it was South Carolina and Georgia, they baked bread. And they took the bread and said, this is from the bread bakers to the bread winners, from the women to the men, so don't vote for ERA. They said other things, that ERA would promote lesbianism, that it would create mandatory abortions, women would be drafted. So there's actually a lot of deceit and dishonesty in the Stop ERA campaign. But it worked, and it sort of galvanized a new movement of conservative women to challenge what they saw as these liberal feminists ruining the traditional roles of wives and mothers. And in fact, that is going to point to the rise of a conservative movement that we're going to see tomorrow in the next activity we'll look at. So what remains now for you is to look at each of these movements and decide if you were alive in the 60s and 70s, which one would you join and why?